This is Mark Strassman, reporter with the Peak Oil Global Warming Channel. We're at Scripps College in Claremont, California, and we're about to speak to William R. Clark, author of Petrodollar Warfare. Welcome to the Peak Oil Global Warming Channel.
Thank you for having me.
The Petrodollar Warfare of the title, I think, has at least two meanings. One is the war in Iraq, and the other is the war between the U.S. and the European Union over how oil will be denominated in world markets. Could you talk about that sort of double meaning in the title?
Sure. My book is really based on two premises, and that is that the world's oil production is soon reaching a peak, or peak oil as they call it, and the second coalescing factor is that the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency is being challenged by the European Union with its euro currency. And there's a whole arcane history regarding petrodollars and petrodollar recycling and the macroeconomic effects of oil being sold and priced in a monopoly currency, i.e. the dollar or petrodollar. And that
tell us a little bit about that story, about what happened in the first oil shock and what its impacts were.
Okay. Just going back a little bit in history, at the end of World War II, the United States dollar was designated the world's reserve currency.
And tell everyone, since it's a crucial concept, what's a world reserve currency, and what's its importance?
The importance of the world reserve currency, contemporarily speaking, is that commodities are priced in the world reserve currency, and contemporarily, as in the end of the World War II period or the post-war period, the debts to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are also denominated in dollars, and therefore the dollar is the world reserve currency for both developing nations to pay off their debts, as well as industrialized nations such as Western Europe, China, etc., and Japan to purchase commodities, the most important commodity being global oil and gas sales. And the world reserve currency is the unit of account or price for global oil sales.
So it's something that's any country that needs to use oil needs to have dollars under the current regime in order to get it.
Yes, in 1974, Saudi Arabia, well, just backing up just for a moment, the dollar used to be backed by gold from 1945 to 1971.
Bretton Woods period, as you know.
Bretton Woods period. The dollar was exchangeable by foreign nationals or foreign nations, $35 per 1 ounce of gold, and that worked for about 26 years.
And some countries actually started to take advantage of it at that point.
Yeah, the problem was the debts of the Vietnam War were so great that there was a real fear amongst some of our allies that the United States dollar was about to become devalued relative to gold. So they began to turn in their dollars in exchange for gold, and Charles de Gaulle of France was sort of started this around 1967, 68.
Because he wanted to undermine American power at the time. He wanted to be premier in Europe, and he didn't want U.S. meddling, and that was the strategy he proposed in the 60s.
Right. But Britain also got very worried, and so the British ambassador in 1971 went to what they called the gold window at the Treasury and requested the redemption of $3 billion. And the gold President Nixon was informed that if these countries, such as France and Europe and these other countries, continued to withdraw the gold out of the U.S. Treasury, that we would no longer be able to maintain this entire system. So he basically pulled the plug on it.
So it's a little like somebody comes up to the bank to teller and says, we want $3 billion in gold, and the teller goes into the back office and talks to President Nixon, who says, we can't do that. And instead he proposed what?
The abandonment of the Bretton Woods gold standard to a floating currency. So in 1971, after August 1971, the dollar became a floating currency.
Right.
And because there were so many dollars in circulation, and we had this
in part to pay for the Vietnam War, which was ended at the time,
and the whole guns and butter thing, Lyndon Johnson, there was massive inflation. There was massive devaluation of the dollar, and President Nixon's 1972 campaign slogan was "Beat Inflation," and it was also the same slogan that basically Carter implemented or had in 1976. So there was a lot of inflation in the 1970s, and what happened is OPEC was losing a lot of money by selling oil and pricing oil only in the dollar. So they began internal discussions to sell oil in a basket of currencies, including the dollar, as well as the German mark, the Japanese yen, the French franc, the Italian lira, the Canadian dollar,
and
the
then,
Swedish krone.
And then apparently Henry Kissinger came to the rescue, and the National Security Advisor during part of this time, and then Secretary of State. What did he propose, and what did he put into place with the recycling of petrodollars from Middle East?
Well, he had the Secretary of the Treasury named William Simon fly personally over Saudi Arabia in 1974 and met with the Saudis and said, you know, we hear that OPEC is thinking about selling oil and a basket of 12 currencies. This will not be good for us. This will not be good for you. You need to put a stop to this, and we, are going to help you do this. And so he actually, the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority, or SAMA, the person appointed to run that was actually an American, and this is during the oil embargo. So at the same time that Saudi Arabia is enjoying with an oil embargo against the United States, an American national was appointed the director of Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority. It'd be sort of like an Iraqi being appointed to run the Federal Reserve right now. A completely a strange situation.
Right. And the upshot of that?
The upshot was that Saudi Arabia squashed the deal on OPEC. Oil was, in 1974, Saudi Arabia secretly agreed to this. They killed this proposal with OPEC to sell oil in multiple currencies, and then in 1975, the rest of OPEC decided to go along with Saudi Arabia, and that transactions for oil would only be in dollars. However, this proposal came up again in 1978 by Kuwait. This time it was three currencies, the Japanese yen, the U.S. dollar, and the German mark, because between 1977 and 1978, the dollar lost 40% of its value relative to the German mark. So once again, OPEC got real nervous. Their purchasing power is going downhill. So let's sell and price oil in three currencies. Once again, this time under a Democratic administration, Simon Blumenthal was the Secretary of Treasury. He flew personally over Saudi Arabia, met with the Saudi finance ministers.
Michael Blumenthal.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Michael Blumenthal, right. There was William Simon and Michael Blumenthal.
Right.
And he, I think Cyrus Vance was involved in all this as well. And once again, our good friends of Saudi Arabia squashed this deal within OPEC, and there was a quid pro quo. We protect the Saudis, and what happened is the Saudis at the time, in 1978, were really interested in increasing their voting power within the IMF, which is sort of based on a complicated formula regarding their GDP. And Saudi Arabia was at number 38 in GDP, but after this meeting, thanks to the United States, they went all the way up to number 8 in power in IMF. It was a 350% increase in voting power, so they were right behind the G7 nations.
So there was a quid pro quo, and what did the Saudis do for their part?
The Saudis killed the proposal by Kuwait and the other members to sell oil in three currencies. Said we will only do dollars, we'll enforce this, and you have to give us power in the IMF in order for us to do this thing. And what's interesting, if you look at research by Dr. David Spiro, who's done really, in my opinion, the only authoritative analysis of petrodollar recycling. He studied from 1973 to 1981 all these declassified documents. There's an interesting comment during this meeting, and that is they told the Saudis that the valuation of the dollar was about to go way up, and they needed to stick it out with us. And what happened was, Paul Volcker became the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and sure enough, interest rates went up to 18% in 1979, 1980. So it almost makes you wonder, when you read these internal talking points between the American Treasury Secretary and Saudi Arabia saying, you got to kill this proposal, and we will give you more power to the IMF. And by the way, the dollar's become much more valuable relative to some of these other currencies, and we'll make sure this happens. You have our president's confidence and assurance this will happen. And sure enough, that did happen.
So as a result of all that,
right,
the dollar remained the
monopoly currency,
monopoly global reserve currency for oil until today, and
until 2000.
Until 2000. Talk about the importance for the American economy, riddled as it is by a federal budget deficit of enormous proportions,
right,
a national debt in the $7 trillion range at this point.
9 trillion almost.
9 trillion.
Right.
And an extraordinarily large balance of payments
right,
problem with the rest of the world, where essentially the U.S. exports dollars and gets stuff.
Right. It's interesting. You read Dr. Spiro's. Here's the book, by the way, The Hidden Hand of American Hegemony. This is an interesting book. The United States showed its first ever trade account deficit in 1971. And at that time, the U.S. Treasury was getting worried. This has never happened before. Who's going to plug this deficit? It was the high oil prices of 1973-74 that plugged it, and they still plug it to this day. There was an article in Business Week just in March of this year called The New Middle East Oil Boom. And a global economist named Paul Donovan at USB in London did an analysis, and he said that petrodollars or petrodollar flows currently finance or fund 45% of the United States current account deficit. The current account deficit is $805 billion in 2005.
What's in the current accounts deficit?
Well, that's our balance of payments. That's the difference between what we consume versus what we import. So as you say, or as you noted, we are importing far more goods and services, especially oil, than what goods and services that we're exporting.
And the biggest things that the U.S. imports essentially is oil and manufactured goods from China and from Japan and from the EU. So essentially, those real things come into the U.S., and the U.S. Treasury prints dollars or electronically generates them in computers and says, we owe you some more, and those dollars are then recycled back into government securities to pay for the federal budget deficit.
That's right. More or less. That's right. This is what Charles de Gaulle called the exorbitant privilege of the world reserve currency and the petrodollar recycling system.
Now you make the argument that Saddam Hussein, that the most dangerous thing he was doing to the United States was not building a nuclear bomb, but threatening to denominate his oil in euros.
Yeah, I think one of the Federal Reserve's worst nightmares would be that the dollar would lose its world reserve currency status, and the way that would happen is if commodities start to be transacted in a different currency. The only currency that really threatens the dollar is the euro, because the European Union's economy is the same size as ours. They don't run the deficits that we are. They're actually bigger. There's 450 million versus 300 million in the United States. And we're about 11 trillion. They're like 10.5 trillion. So it's sort of equivalent, commensurate in size. And so Saddam in 2000, the fall of 2000, said, I really can't do anything about what's happening, but
because he was under sanctions from the UN generated by the U.S. after having lost the first Gulf War.
He couldn't really control where his oil was going, but he did say, I'm going to, because I'm at the United States, I'm going to switch over to the euro because the French and the Germans and the Russians are not on the euro, but they're being nice to me. They're trying to get the sanctions lifted. So he switched to euro. He said, you can buy all the oil you want from me, you have to pay in euros. The United States actually bought the majority of the oil under the oil food program. It was like 55 to 64% depending upon the year. So ExxonMobil and all these companies beginning in November 2000 up until we invaded had to pay for Iraq's oil in the euro.
So they had to use their dollars to buy euros.
Yes.
Did that strengthen the euro as a currency vis-a-vis the dollar?
If you look at what happened in 2001 and 2002, you really wonder if that was happening. What was interesting is when Saddam made the switch in November of 2000, actually he announced in September, the euro was only 82 cents to the dollar, which was at its historic low point. So everyone said, well, you're going to lose, $400 million in oil profits this year, or the next year by doing this. This doesn't make any sense, but it was, to him, he was willing to take the economic hit because he wanted to hit back politically, I suppose. But what happened was the euro had started at 117 and went down to 82, and then it started to go back up in 2000. And then by July of 2002, it reached parity, and then after that, it went above the dollar. It's been above the dollar for over 4 years now.
So you could almost track the U.S. preparation for the war in Iraq with the rise of the euro.
I don't know if I would go so far as to say that, but I would say, but what happened that was interesting is the Oil for Food program, which had $10 billion in it when he made the switch. At the time of the invasion, it had 26 billion euros. He almost tripled the savings account of the country because of the steady appreciation of the euro relative to the dollar. So Saddam made a financial windfall, which was never, ever reported in the United States media, but I reported on this in my essays.
Okay, let's talk about those two things, your essay and the U.S. media.
Right.
Tell us about the essay you wrote that became the germ for Petrodollar Warfare, the book.
In the summer of 2002, when the whole propaganda campaign really started to go into high gear regarding Saddam, Osama bin Saddam or whatever, who's something to do with 911 and reconstituted nuclear weapons programs, all these kind of things, it didn't make sense to me because we dismantled all that stuff. And so I began to research, why in the world are we going after Iraq?
Let's go back one more step. What were you doing before that? What's your day job that you seem to have abandoned, perhaps, in order to pursue this?
No, I still have a day job. Okay. I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. I was also a manager there for the School of Medicine. I did 2 master's degrees there. I did an MBA, and this is at the time when I was finishing up my MBA. I was going to start my second master's in science, and I was I was talking to the associate dean at the business school, who was actually a former presidential appointee for the U.S. Department of Treasury under the Clinton administration. And I uncovered that Saddam had switched to the euro as his oil transaction currency. I wasn't really sure about the significance of this, but to me, I heard about the petrodollars, and I knew there was some system by which Kissinger had spoke about this. So I began to really research this. And
so, in fact, you were doing what Woodward and Bernstein did, which was follow the money.
Yes, you could say that.
Okay, and what did you find, and what did you write in your first essay about this?
That's when I discovered this book. This came out in 1999. It's a very obscure book. And it was written over a 15-year period in which this guy, Dr. Spiro, who was a former economist at Cornell, this book came out in 1999, exposes the whole history of how this was set up and the macroeconomic effects.
Take 2 minutes and tell us what Dr. Spiro says.
He says that when the dollar lost its gold backing, the United States went through extraordinary measures to maintain the dollar's monopoly pricing, or unit of account for oil sales, and the monopoly transaction. And he uncovered this stuff with all these, former declassified CIA documents and U.S. Treasury documents, and said that the United States was really worried about its hegemonic power, and so it used Saudi Arabia to leverage this and maintain the system, and that what it does is it drives a huge amount of liquidity or demand value for the dollars, which allows us to expand the credit, or the Federal Reserve to expand the credit. And
personal credit for the trillions of dollars in credit that Americans have on their credit cards.
Yeah, the whole money supply of
the
dollars.
whole house of credit cards that is the American economy is backed up by the dollar as the world reserve currency.
And the petrodollar recycling system is what underpins, in my opinion, along with the IMF loans.
Right.
The commodities pricing, and most important, of course, was global oil sales, is backed by the petrodollar recycling system. So he exposes this. So I began to research what happens. What would happen if OPEC members such as Iran started selling, or Russia, which sells most of their oil to the European Union anyway? What would happen? So I began to try to explore this and work this out economically, and I realized this is a big, big issue, and I was encouraged by others to pursue this. I wrote an essay in the winter of 2002 before the war started, and I said, I think that this war in Iraq has something to do with peak oil and a lot to do with money and power and hegemony.
And what kind of reaction did you get to the essay?
Around the world, it went around the world, and it was translated in different languages. I was interviewed on several continents: Australia, South America, Brazil.
How about the CBS News?
But the United States media didn't touch it.
How about the ABC News?
They wouldn't touch it.
How about the New York Times?
Wouldn't touch it.
Newsweek?
Wouldn't touch it.
Wall Street Journal?
Wouldn't touch it.
Well, here you are on the peak oil
Actually,
global
the Wall Street Journal did barely touch it after the war started.
Okay, well, you're here on the Peak Oil Global Warming Challenge.
Right.
You can tell by our title what we're interested in. Why do you think that the mainstream media in the U.S. hasn't picked up on the ideas that you put forward in that essay and in this book?
Because the United States media is owned by 5 large corporations, and the threat to the dollar is a threat to their bottom line, and therefore they don't want to inform the people of these challenges that are facing the United States economy at a macro level.
Okay, how about the politicians, the elected officials of the American government, whose job it is to ostensibly to look out for the welfare of the American people?
The only U.S. politician who's dared mention this, he gave a whole speech on it, was just earlier this year, was Ron Paul of Texas, who's sort of a libertarian. He's a Republican in label, but he's really a libertarian. He's the only guy out of the other 500 of them in Washington who will dare mention this. In fact, I had a personal conversation with the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Virginia while I was at Hopkins in graduate school. He completely didn't want to talk about it. I even called C-SPAN one morning. I talked to the Undersecretary of Energy before the war of the Bush administration. I asked him this question on C-SPAN Live about Saddam's switch to the euro, and he completely obfuscated his answer and would not admit to it. It's taboo, completely taboo.
So from all of this, from your studies and from the reaction you've gotten, would it be fair to say that this is an open secret that's at the heart of why the U.S. is in Iraq right now?
It is an open secret within the United States. It is not an open secret around the world. Canada knows about it.
I mean, it is open. It's not a secret. This is widely understood around the world.
Quasi-secret.
Right. Okay.
And American people who, they just don't know these things, but the Europeans know it, the Asians know it, the Canadians know it. the people in Latin America know about it.
And all right, now talk about what you see as the connection between peak oil, recycling of petrodollars versus petro euros, and the generation of the war in Iraq.
I think they coalesce to produce this tragic military quagmire over there. I think that the Bush administration, and Cheney in particular, knows all about peak oil.
To tell our listeners who just got here what peak oil is and why it matters for what we're talking about.
Well, it's a whole lecture in itself.
Right.
But basically, in essence, every oil field around the world sort of has a bell-shaped curve. You find the oil, you begin to produce it. There's a pressure that's been created over millions and millions of years, geological history. That pressure reaches a peak. You reach a peak in production, then it begins to tail off. Every oil field, there's about 40,000 or more oil fields in the world, have this general bell-shaped curve.
And because every oil field has that curve, the aggregate has the same curve.
Right. If you aggregate all the oils, or every country, you can look at these curves of countries, and if you aggregate all the countries together, you get this one gigantic bell-shaped, raggedy curve because of what happened in the 1970s. And basically, peak oil is the point where, from a geological or geophysical perspective, that oil production reaches its maximum, and due to the declining pressure, it begins to taper off. There's really nothing you can do. You can apply technology which will extract more, and it may draw out the curve a little bit on the downslope, but once you've reached peak oil, you've reached peak.
And in fact, that's happened in many countries, starting pretty much with the United States in 1971,
yes,
and been repeated in other countries, so that at this point, what's keeping the curve still rising globally is the oil where?
Well, there's a debate, but it's pretty much the Middle East.
And Nigeria.
And Algeria, right. Nigeria, and Russia.
Okay. And what's the geopolitical significance of the world beginning to run out of oil?
Well, the geopolitical significance is that man-made economic theorems, or contemporary economic theorems, are based on unlimited growth. And there's a strong correlation between high oil prices and recessions. And so if we reach a point where the primary fossil fuel that drives 98% of the global transportation system, therefore ergo it drives the global economy, begins to reach a point where demand outstrips the availability of the finite resource, and that means there are limitations to economic growth in the contemporary sense, and therefore that's a serious conundrum.
And what's the importance of economic growth to the political stability of any country, and in particular the United States?
Because our current monetary system is based on debt and paying the interest on money that is loaned on the assumption that future economic growth will pay for that principal plus its interest. And if peak oil if you really think about it, you begin to ask yourselves, well, if we reach peak oil and there's a slowdown, an aggregate slowdown in the global economy and local economies, will there be future growth to pay for all the debt that we've created, which is $9 trillion in this country? And I think the answer is basically probably not.
And if that debt were, who owns that debt?
The number one and number two are the Chinese and Japanese. The South Koreans they own a lot of our debt.
The people who work hard, save a lot of money, and sell things to the United States.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
It's a little like the grasshopper and the ants. With the U.S. as a big grasshopper, and the ants as a lot of ants doing the work and living on the kindness of strangers, essentially, right now.
Yeah, we are living on the kindness of strangers, unfortunately. In the petrodollar, see, the United States borrows $2.2 billion per day from strangers, and $1 billion of that, or 45% of our current debt, is petrodollar flows. So the petrodollar flows that flow in this country today, tomorrow, the next day, and the next day are approximately $1 billion per day. So any threat to that system means that our ability to expand and continue our debt financing becomes under pressure and may not be viable over the long term.
So as you see it, why did President Bush and Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld and Condi Rice decide to invade Iraq?
Control over oil and preservation of the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
Okay. That doesn't seem to be working out for them right now, today. It seems that it's never been working out worse since they started than today. What do you make of that, and what do you see as the implications of that? Because as you've just said, the linchpin of American hegemony was taking over the oil in Iraq, as you, if I had let you say it, in order to get Iraq's seat in OPEC and keep OPEC from denominating oil in euros. Now that the enterprise Iraqi freedom seems to have failed, what does that mean for the U.S. plan to maintain its hegemony by controlling the oil and the world reserve currency?
It means, in Paul Kennedy's terminology, the rise and fall of great empires, it means imperial overstretch. It means that we are now an empire in decline, And I think the policies of the politicians from this point forward should be managing and mitigating our decline regarding these global macroeconomic energy issues, which are going to hit us no matter what. So we need to begin really looking at ourselves as an empire of military bases with a global plan that just didn't quite work out, and therefore we need to begin managing our decline, because I think it's quite clear that all the symptoms going on in Iraq are what you would call imperial overstretch.
Okay, talk about the possible reactions to that among the elite and among the masses in terms of a large part of the U.S. wouldn't acknowledge that there is an empire, let alone overreach. What does this mean for them, and how do you expect the elites to deal with this issue? They're now trying to finesse the Iraqization and withdrawal from Iraq. But if that happens, the big plan won't have taken place. What do you see in, let's say the Democrats take over the House and the Senate next month, will that make any difference? If the Democrats take over the White House in 2008, will that make any difference? What strategy do you think they should use and will use in this next stage of imperial overreach failure?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think if there's a change in governing philosophy, again, the goal should be managing the decline. The neoconservatives are completely unable to negotiate global monetary reform. They're completely unable to implement energy conservation or viable energy.
Do the Democrats seem
I'm not
better
so sure
equipped?
that they're able to do it either.
There's a mass movement, or the stirrings of a mass movement in the peak oil movement and the sustainability movement, of which you're a part and which your book generates more attention to.
Right.
What do you see as a possible strategy for that movement to build awareness and action along the lines that you're suggesting?
Well, we almost need what I would call maybe a peak oil peace party, because right now we have a peak oil war party where you have an administration that knows about peak oil and they are forcefully pushing warfare, with Iran being the next target of this issue. We almost need to have a party that just puts out peace, compromise, and a return to what the Founding Fathers suggested that would be, and that is not an empire.
You quote a lot of the Founding Fathers, particularly Thomas Jefferson. Talk about what he and Madison and Washington would make of all this, and their point of view on the crisis we're in right now.
Well, that's another. Let's see. I'll find one quote from Jefferson. Let's see if I can find it real quickly, because we've gone so far from what they had intended, and there's
This is what Gore Vidal has been writing about for 30 years, about republic into empire.
Yes. Here's what Thomas Jefferson said, and the empire of his day was the British Empire and the French Empire, and he said this: "We believe no more in Francis Napoleon Bonaparte's fighting for the liberties of the seas than in Great Britain's fighting for the liberties of mankind. The object is the same: to draw to themselves the power, the wealth, and the resources of other nations." So basically he's saying we don't believe in this imperialistic propaganda that Bonaparte of France and King George of England are talking about.
He was a Republican with a small r.
Right.
It looks like, though, from the fact that the dynamics that you quoted Jefferson commenting on 200 years ago has arisen again. The Roman Republic, the American Republic. There's a tendency. Plato talked about it in the Republic,
right.
Saying that the tendency of democracy is to disintegrate into dictatorship. What forces do you see working against that, and what strategy on what program in the next 3 minutes would you like to see happen in response to this crisis?
The main thing is going to require people at the local level to understand and accept global peak oil and try to mitigate and understand that the government is incapable, at least currently, as it's currently structured and currently funded, incapable of making the necessary changes that are required because of Mother Nature, because you really can't debate Mother Nature. You have to accept her.
How important is alternative energy in this picture, renewable energy rather than fossil fuel?
It's extremely important. I mean, fossil fuel is finite, and so whether we, if we go around killing millions and millions of people over, we're still going to burn it up and it'll be gone. And then what? And we'll spend all of our capital, all of our men, all of our resources. We'll be bankrupt, or morally, economically, and we'll have nothing to show for this. So this goes back to this thing about Paul Kenny's imperial overstretch. That what happens with empires is they begin, once their economy starts to go down, they have this tendency to go use military force to achieve things. But why they get trapped in that model, so they can't spend the necessary investments at home to rejuvenate their economy, to sort of flatten things out and get back at a steady state. So
okay, now the people who are running Proposition 87 are promising, here in California, are promising cheap energy as a result, and promising people they can keep driving their SUVs using ethanol, essentially. Do you think that the what Richard Heinberg calls power down will be possible without a reduction in what's currently understood as the standard of living of people in the industrialized countries, in particular the United States, given even an all-out move to alternative renewable energies?
There's no doubt in my mind that we're going to have less available energy when I'm an older man. I mean, we have to do power down. I mean, the energy density of fossil fuels is greater. The hydrocarbon molecule is almost magical. There's nothing that we found that is as transportable and provides the energy density. You can't run airplanes on coal or wood or anything like that. So, regarding Proposition 87, Richard Heinberg also has a term called the magic elixir, and that's this belief that something will come and save the day in the end. We can continue the status quo, and that's a very dangerous mentality. I think that power down is the only way forward, and that's a very hard thing for us to really assimilate.
Okay, now you made the point earlier that your ideas about this, whether they're right or wrong, haven't been subjected to mass public debate because the media, which determines what's on the agenda for debate, has shut them out.
Right.
This video will be available on the internet, but it doesn't have the advertising budget that ABC News does.
Right.
Given that, and given the centrality of understanding, of seeing what you've understood and are trying to communicate,
right,
and it's blocked, and it's being blocked by the media conglomerates, what do you see as a possible strategy to get the word out to people? And beyond that, do you think people are ready to make the moral, physical, economic commitments necessary to implement power down or some variation of it? And you've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, I think that using the internet obviously is the most logical strategy because it's not filtered like the mainstream media news is. And
apart from net neutrality issues, of course.
Right. But the internet obviously is the best vehicle to spread the word and get people activated in local levels. Regarding whether or not the American people and the global community are able, willing to do the power down scenario is a question that I think we're going to struggle with for a whole generation. I think this is going to be an ongoing issue for 20, 30, 40 years. And there are things that I'm doing personally. I think other people have to do similar types of things to reduce their energy usage. And like I said, we can complain about Mother Nature, but we can't manipulate her. We have to live within her constraints.
To say a little bit more about a peak oil party and what platform you think it ought to have.
It needs to be based on fundamentals of global monetary reform and massive reallocation. I mean massive, like World War II style reallocation towards infrastructure changes, such as light rail, to reduce as fast as humanly possible our hydrocarbon consumption. We have to restructure our society. We have to begin producing food locally. We can produce electricity much easier than we can find fossil fuels around the world and conquer nations. So we need to look at the entire restructuring of the transportation system.
Okay, you got about 30 seconds. Tell us why this is important and how hopeful you are that a resolution will be possible.
It is the challenge of the 21st century. It is a unique moment in time, and it will either be tremendous pain and suffering or tremendous liberation once we get through this. But it's going to be a very difficult transition. And regarding my hopefulness, I vacillate between positive and negative, but I think it's going to happen for 20, 30 years. I have to go through this whole debate.
Thanks very much for talking to us on the Peak Oil Global Warming channel today at Scripps.